Greetings, greetings, greetings. Welcome to another Alkebulan Awakening series. My name, as always, is Oladele Dosumu. I am the co-founder of Emerging Alkebulan. And what we do on this platform, we try to do on this platform, is actually to decolonize our minds and awaken our consciousness. Welcome to this session, everyone. Nduku.
Karibuni, asanteni kwa kuwa nasi. Thank you all for joining us. The name is Nduku. I am the host on Kumbukeni, always joining my brother for these very informative conversations. Looking forward to this one because economic is a key part of our being that is often ignored and that I think should be included in basic studies when it comes to children, right? That should be like the basis economics. So looking forward to this conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome.
Welcome. Okay, we've got our guest here, Fadhel Kaboub. I'm going to let him introduce himself, but he's going to talk about how do we decolonize our African economic structures? How do we decolonize it? Because at the moment, we see where we are. Everything we do is linked to the hegemonic powers. How can African economics be truly, truly free? Fadhel, I'll let you introduce yourself and then just take us through the topic. And then just for those who are listening, I know there's a lot of people who want to ask questions. Please, if you have any questions, just put on the chat. Once we're done with the presentation, then we will basically ask the questions. So if you got any questions as Fadhel is speaking, please put it on the chat. We'll highlight them and we'll ask the questions once we're done with the presentation. Thanks for everybody for listening and watching.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you again for hosting this conversation and for the kind invitation. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I'm a Tunisian economist. I teach at Denison University in Ohio in the United States. I teach economics. And I'm the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Most of my work focuses on bringing global South perspectives to the process of economic development. It sounds, almost too obvious to say, but unfortunately, a lot of the literature and the approach to economic development is actually global North oriented and comes from a global North perspective. And over the years, I became increasingly convinced that the process of decolonization that the generations of our fathers and grandfathers started is the unfinished business that our generation needs to finalize. But unfortunately, it's also a process that most people thought was finished, was done, that we should be dealing with other issues. And my work is really trying to get us back to the foundations. So that's in a nutshell. For people who are interested, I write a blog called Global South Perspectives on Substack, and it's free. So you can read, short pieces that are related to this work, and you can, find quite a bit of my work on social media available for free, of course.
Thank you very much, my brother. So if you want to speak to the topic, please, sir.
So the question of decolonization. So a lot of people are familiar with the concept of sovereignty. We have sovereign nations, supposedly, and that is the narrow definition of sovereignty, which is you have a flag, you have a government, you have your territory, your army, your football team, your national anthem, and we think we have sovereignty and independence because foreign troops have left a long time ago, although in many parts of the continent they haven't actually left to this day. But that's the narrow definition of sovereignty. What we focus on is really the concept of economic and monetary sovereignty. And before we can talk about what it is that we want to decolonize, it's very important to understand what the colonial economic structure was designed to do. And then we'll understand that it's still actually doing what it was designed to do, that it never left. So you can summarize the economic role that was imposed on the African continent in three major points. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that function to this day. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technology from the industrialized world, not the producers, the consumers. And we still play that function to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world, is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, technical assistance. But effectively, what it does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that role to this day. So these are the three major colonial roles that persist to this day. That's why we still insist on saying that our economies are still, still have colonial structures. And colonialism, just in case people forgot, is a system that was designed to produce violence, injustice, extractivism, hierarchies. It was not a system designed for development. It was not a system designed for democracy or justice or any of the good things that we want to achieve today. So why are we confused? Why are we, you know, keeping a colonial system that was designed to produce all the bad results and then are surprised by our situation, saying, well, we don't have democracy, we don't have, development, we have, hierarchies and inequality. Well, the system is working perfectly the way it was designed. So what we need to do is change the engine of the system. So that's point number one. Point number two, which is very important observation for us to put on the table, is every policy advice that comes from the global north, every partnership proposal, every cooperation proposal that comes from the global north, we have to run it through a filter, run it through a system that says, is this policy proposal going to repeat those three functions or undo those three functions? And I guarantee you, once you start thinking in this way, you realize that there's nothing coming from the global north, whether it's on debt or development or climate or education or anything that actually doesn't reproduce those structures. So that should be the filter that we as Africans, as people of the global south, our governments, our leaders should be using to assess our relationship with NESs, even when people are coming to you with technical assistance and with money as grants, not even loans. Grants can also be part of the entrapment, right? So we have to wake up and realize that this is the filter that we should be using. And then we have to realize that our experts on the continent, myself included, right? People who went through the Western education system, the economics curriculum that we went through, we also went through a system that is deeply colonial in its thinking. So you can be African, you can be an expert, you can be, the number one supporter of Pan-Africanism and African liberation, and still be deeply rooted in neo-colonial thinking because of your education. So decolonizing the mind is a very serious thing. Of course, people are familiar with the book and with the concept, but it's easier said than done, right? So we have a lot of work to do so that we start assessing our own thinking about what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is not good. And I was able over time to kind of go back to these three major points and say, okay, my thinking might be, neo-colonial, my education might be neo-colonial, but I need to know if this particular policy proposal is going to perpetuate these three economic functions or undo them. That's the simplest filter I can come up with. And then you think backwards and you try to realize, okay, so what is the alternative? And we can go through a whole bunch of false solutions and dangerous distractions that are being implemented today as, quote unquote, good solutions for development, for democratization, for decarbonization, for saving the planet. Most of them are actually designed for economic entrapment. And I'm often reminded of the famous phrase from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is relevant in this case, in the context of the civil rights movement in the US, but it's relevant to our discussion here. When he said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions. I'm paraphrasing a little bit of his famous line here, but we need to be thinking in similar ways. There is no time for tranquilizing drugs, for false solutions, for gradualism. So that is the thing. And Martin Luther King, like many other thought leaders, he was a radical in not necessarily in the political sense of the term, although that might be true, but in the literal sense of the term. And all of us need to be radical in this sense, because in the literal sense, when you say radical, it means you go to the roots of the problem. And if you don't go to the roots, then you're operating at the surface level. And surface level intervention is designed to produce the status quo. So either radical solutions to undo the colonial role that was imposed on us. Otherwise, it's a superficial solution that's designed to produce the status quo, meaning the same colonial hierarchy, the same extractive, abusive, violent, non-democratic, unjust system. And we have to be very clear about it. If we're willing to accept that, then we just accept false solutions and celebrate false solutions and accept the colonial structures, and then not complain about the injustice, about the underdevelopment, about all the bad things. But if we want to complain about the bad things, then we have to go to the roots of the problem and undo them one by one. So this is kind of in a way of opening the
Yeah.
discussion. And then I want to zoom in on particular aspects, because people say, well, what are the practical solutions? Where do we go with this? So a lot of people focus on the issue of debt. We say, well, we don't have money. We have to prioritize paying the debt. Well, you have to look at the source of external debt. And here we're talking about debt denominated in dollars and euros and British pounds. You look at the African continent, country by country, and you identify three major sources of that external debt, of the debt trap. Number one, it's the lack of food sovereignty. The fact that the continent today imports 85% of its food, when we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers less than a century ago. And that is not by accident, that is by design. And I'll explain very briefly what the design was. As soon as our country started to gain independence, there was actually a meeting in Europe, in Rome in 1955, one of the basic sort of pillars and foundations of the European Union, this meeting for the Treaty of Rome, where part of the discussion was, we have a problem in Europe, which is lack of food sovereignty. We're so dependent on the colonies. We need to change that. And that started a process that eventually led to the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP for short, which is in place to this day, a basic pillar of the European Union, a system of heavy agricultural subsidies to support European farmers to produce wheat, corn, soybean, the core crops, barley, and so on. And it wasn't, of course, just Europe. It was the rest of the industrialized world, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so on. All of these countries introduced heavy agricultural subsidies for core crops. And that forced our farmers out of business because they couldn't compete with the cheaper wheat and corn and barley coming from the subsidizing countries. So our farmers had to switch and specialize in what we call cash crops for exports. That's the coffee and tea and tobacco and all the other, tropical fruits and all that, which on the surface of it, is not a problem. But then you dig deeper and you realize now you have no food security. And the concept of food security was actually introduced during that time period in the 50s and 60s, because food security in the colloquial sense, when you and I speak about it, is kind of a, who doesn't like food security? But food security is a technical colonial term that was introduced, which means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people, either by producing it yourself, which we don't do anymore, or by buying it from abroad, which we do, or by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is how we get into a debt trap, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. And you go back to the 50s and 60s and you remember the history of food aid interventions coming to save the starving people of the global south. Well, why are they starving? Because of the heavy agricultural subsidies that destroyed the livelihood of their farmers, right? So food aid was the last nail in the coffin of our food sovereignty. So that's how we are today. And of course, this has severe consequences, not just in terms of debt, but also in terms of ecological consequences, environmental consequences, because when we specialize in producing cash crops for exports, then you have to focus on and prioritize what your consumers in the global north want to eat. So you start using non-native crops that are not native to your soil. You start using crops that need more irrigation, more water, which you have to build the infrastructure for and the logistics for. You have to use crops that require fertilizers because they're not used to your environment, and pesticides so the crops can survive the journey all the way to a supermarket in Sweden or in Switzerland or whatever, all of which you have to import. And you do that for 30, 40, 50 years, you've just burnt the fertility of your soil. And now you have to double down on bringing more potent seeds and fertilizers and pesticides, all of which you have to import. Right? And then comes Bill Gates with his solution, right, with the GMOs and all of that. So that's just one of the major sources of external debt. And you can see how, it goes beyond debt, right? And now we have to undo all of this damage by investing in food sovereignty and agroecology, not just as a solution to the debt problem, but as an ecological solution, as a solution so we can cope with the impact of climate change. That's source number one. Source number two is energy sovereignty or energy deficits. And when I say energy deficits on the continent, I'm not talking about my country, Tunisia, which doesn't have a lot of fossil fuels or energy sources in the past. I'm talking about our number one oil exporter on the continent and our number two oil exporter on the continent. And our number three, the biggest exporters, have energy deficits. Nigeria, up until just a few months ago when the Dangote refinery opened, up to that point, Nigeria imported 100% of its gasoline from international markets. Angola, our second exporter, imports to this day 80% of its fuel from international markets. Why? Because in the old energy system that we're trying to phase out, the fossil fuel system, we've always the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. Denied access to the technology. The technology exists for more than 100 years now. We never have access, full control, full sovereignty over that technology, which is why, it took Nigeria, decades when it's, the Dangote refinery is 50 years too late, right? The $20 billion should have been invested in our biggest potential, which is renewables today. So that's the energy sovereignty part. And similarly, by the way, today we're also being denied access to the technology to manufacture the renewable energy infrastructure, which is our biggest potential on the continent. And as you know, we talked about food and energy. No country on this planet can function without food, without energy. And we're already deficient in those two areas. And number three, the kind of manufacturing base, the big industrial activity that countries are supposed to have, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have is the kind where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with a manufacturing base that exports low value-added content and imports high value-added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports with free trade agreements and partnerships and all of that. You're still locked at the bottom of the value chain. So now take these three components together, food, energy, and manufacturing deficits, and you have a structural trade deficit year after year, decade after decade. And the simple explanation, the economics of it here for the audience to understand is that when a country has a trade deficit, its currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar and the euro. So imagine you're Kenya. The Kenyan shilling is now weaker relative to the dollar. And with the weaker Kenyan shilling, everything I need to import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, medical equipment, anything is going to be more expensive because I have a weak currency. So this is true for the entire continent. All of our imports, basic necessities, food, fuel, medicine, and so on, we import them at a higher cost. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our livelihood, food, fuel, and medicine. So that immediately forces our governments to put themselves in a defensive position to protect the most vulnerable, to do their best. So what do? Immediate band-aid solution, you subsidize food. You subsidize fuel, you subsidize health services as much as you can. And of course, it's unsustainable to do this for decades. And then the second thing our governments do is ask the experts, the central bankers, right? The guys who manage the foreign currency reserves and the value of the currency and inflation. And they say to them, do your best to strengthen our currency, to stabilize the exchange rate. What do? They do the band-aid solution, which is borrow more dollars to stabilize the exchange rate and get deeper and deeper into that debt trap. And that is the source of the debt. And it has very serious colonial links to what I described earlier in terms of the food and energy and the colonial role that was imposed on our economies to be limited to low value added manufacturing, obsolete assembly line manufacturing. So now, when you have a major debt problem, like most of our countries do, then it's the lenders who impose on you the conditionalities of how to use the money, how to prioritize your budget. And of course, what they impose is, don't you dare invest in food sovereignty. Don't you dare invest in health and education. You have to prioritize investing in economic activity that will quickly generate dollars to pay us back. So that means you prioritize all the extractive policies, and you prioritize getting locked at the bottom of the value chain to assemble stuff for them, because that's what foreign investors do. They want cheap, low cost labor, low cost materials to be assembled for their economy, not for your economy. And even when they invest in your energy system, it's to invest so that they can build consume in the global north. Most of Nigeria's oil is not consumed there. And today, in the new energy system of green hydrogen and solar and green electricity, same thing. Investors are investing in order to extract green hydrogen, to extract solar, and so on. So if we're going to succeed in decolonizing, we have to invest in food sovereignty, not food security. We have to invest in renewable energy sovereignty, which is our biggest potential. And I'll give you just one number, because I know some people say, well, we have a lot of oil, we have a lot of gas. No, we don't. We have thousands of times more renewable energy potential than the obsolete energy system of the past. According to IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, 2 years ago, their report on Africa, you can summarize it in one number. They said by 2040, the African continent can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs from renewables and completely replace all the fossil fuel exports. 1,000 times. Now, why are we not doing this? Why are we not attracting the financing and the manufacturing of renewable energy infrastructure? We attract less than 2% of financing that goes towards renewables. And there's a very clear reason for this. Because if you actually unleash Africa's renewable energy potential the way it should be, then it's as if you've taken the power of OPEC, the oil exporting countries, which, these countries have, a significant weight in the energy system globally, a significant geopolitical weight, economic weight. Take that weight, multiply it by 1,000. That's Africa's potential. Now we see it as an opportunity, right? But people outside the continent, the adversaries of the continent, let's call them, they see it as a threat. They see it as a risk to be managed, to be eliminated, which is why we don't get access to technology to unleash that potential or financing to unleash that potential. And number 3, we need to invest in Pan-African industrial policies, not to assemble stuff for other people, but to build the building blocks of development and prosperity on the continent, starting with the things that we actually need. What we need is unleash our potential in the energy system. So manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, not for exports, but to deliver to the millions of people who have no access to electricity today as we speak. Number 2, to manufacture and deploy clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people on the continent today who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure, mostly women and children. And number 3, to manufacture and deploy the clean transportation infrastructure, to build the logistics of development and prosperity, to connect our cities, our economies on the continent, so that our logistical infrastructure is not built outwards towards the ports to export. We want the continent to build the inwards logistics of infrastructure and development. And I insist on this being Pan-African industrial policies, not national industrial policies, not because Pan-Africanism is just a nice thing we say to each other in these meetings and we celebrate Pan-Africanism. I say it because Pan-Africanism and South-South unity and solidarity is actually an economic and geopolitical necessity. It's not just a nice thing to have. Without it, we will not have anything. And there's a very simple economic reason for it, because industrialization requires what economists call economies of scale. Economies of scale is a very simple concept without which you can't industrialize. Let's say I want to manufacture this pen. If I manufacture only 1,000 units per year, it's like doing it by hand, essentially. Very few units. So the cost per pen will be very expensive. But if I manufacture 10 million units per month, right, because I have access to a large market like the continent, then the cost per unit will become cheaper. The quality will improve. The efficiency will kick in. And then innovation and research and development will kick in immediately. So our economies are too small to industrialize. Because if you try to industrialize by yourself, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy, which is what we do today. But the advantage that we have is that we're a continent of 1.2, 1.3 billion people. We're the size of India and China, right? Except potentially richer because we have all the resources and we have the youngest labor force on the planet. We have the complementarity of resources and capabilities across the continent. So that is the opportunity, which again, every time I say it's the opportunity, you have to remember that it's perceived as a threat, as a risk to be managed, to be eliminated. So that's why I insist on Pan-African industrial policies. And that's why you go back and you realize that's why we've always been denied access to the financing, but especially the technology to unleash that potential. So first, we have to do our homework as Africans to co-design these strategies, to understand that without these strategies, we will not move forward. Without these strategies and without unity, we will not move forward. And then strategize and come up with a geopolitical leverage that will force the other economic blocs that actually have access to the technology to actually share it with us, to do real partnership rather than neo-colonial extraction. And I can talk a little bit, in the discussion about what that geopolitical leverage should be and what is the opportunity that we have today. But I'll open it up for discussion so we can have more time to unpack.
Okay, bro, thanks for that powerful start because it basically unpacks everything I've been thinking and more. So my first question to you, I've got quite a few questions all over the place on my phone and my notebook. So I've got questions from people who I've got people on this question on the screen as well. But my first question to you is, saying what you said and knowing what we know now, why? And I personally know what your answer is going to be, but why are African leaders not doing the needful to make this work for us? Why are they being the weaker link for African countries?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. So the way I think about it, I imagine, our adversaries in the global north, let's call them, some presidents and prime ministers who don't want to see this potential unleashed, kind of sitting in their office and they have like a dashboard for each one of our countries, dashboard of vulnerabilities, pressure points, buttons to push. You have a dashboard that has, this first button is called food security. You can push that button, you can make that country starve. Debt is another pressure point. Energy security, domestic security, right? The regional security. There's so many pressure points, vulnerabilities for each one of our countries. And what I described earlier is basically saying that all of our countries have almost exactly the same pressure points. You're not going to be able to eliminate them alone. You have to join forces to eliminate those. So if one of your pressure points is food, you have to build food sovereignty. If one of your pressure points is energy, you have to build energy sovereignty. Debt, same thing. So what we need to do is work on this. The problem is that even the leaders who recognize that this needs to be done, it's an overwhelming task. And they think about it, this is the problem, they think about it at the national level, which is why they fail. But they're politicians. I mean, those of them who have elections every 4 years, where do you start? And the problem is that they have technical advisors in our own countries, right? Ministers and advisors who, as I described earlier, have been, trained by the IMF and the World Bank and the economics education that goes with that whole neoliberal and neo-colonial approach. So our own people in government are disempowered to think outside the box. And this is why this approach that I'm describing and the work that we've been doing over the last few years is really trying to, make the case that actually a better world is actually within reach. right? If you watch that American movie, the Wakanda or whatever, the real Wakanda is right there
Yeah, yeah.
within reach. We have to, and we have that potential. And I'll give you a quick example, because when you think of agriculture, food sovereignty, it sounds overwhelming. But the good news is that every metric ton of corn you plant this year, you produce this year, saves you its equivalent in dollars you had to borrow and interest you have to pay for the next 20 years.
Mm.
Just 1 metric ton. So what does it take to produce 1 metric ton? A little bit more land and a little bit of labor, all of which you pay for with the domestic currency. You don't need dollars from the World Bank to produce more wheat.
Mm,
So these are things, and the good news is that an agricultural season is just 12 months. So in
mm,
12 months, you can get yourself one step out of the trap, and then you can double down on those things. But it's more nuanced than that, because there are serious problems with this. Why? Because our ministries of agriculture across the continent are designed to prioritize producing cash crops for exports, coffee, tea, tomatoes, all of that stuff. So what they do is they prioritize giving the most fertile soil, the most precious water resources to farmers who are going to export. And you and I today, in any African country, we can go to the Ministry of Agriculture and say, we are new investors. We want to produce wheat or corn. Can you help us? Can you assist us? Is there land? Are there subsidies? Are there fertilizers? Is there water? You get nothing. Nothing.
mhm,
But the same individuals, we go to the same office in the Ministry of Agriculture in any African country, say, we want to produce strawberries to export to Switzerland. They say, well, you get 0% interest, you get land, you get logistical support, you get, bank guarantees. All the doors are open. So we need to start there. The problem is in the ministries of agriculture in most of the continent. And that is just agriculture, right? And then go
mhm,
sector by sector. And then, of course, you have to recognize that there are power structures, because ministries of agriculture may be kind of on autopilot, designed to do this because of kind of inertia and routine, and this is what they think is the right thing. But then there's real power that you need to undo. I'll give you an example of Nigeria a few years ago decided to invest in producing more rice, right? For rice sovereignty. You can produce
Yeah,
more rice in Nigeria instead of
yeah,
importing it. And they put the resources, government commitment, everything, right? Supporting farmers to do it. They forgot one thing, that there is something called market power, which
mhm,
is, and I'm not an expert on Nigerian agriculture or market power, but when a colleague was describing to me why this policy failed, I asked the following question. I told her, I guarantee you there's probably 4, maybe 5 guys who have the exclusive import license for the entire country to import rice.
yeah,
And those guys didn't like what the government was
yeah,
doing, so they
yeah.
used every inch of power they have to destroy that policy. And that particular colleague, who happens to be a journalist, told me, how did you know? I said, I don't know. I'm
mm,
guessing, because this is how power works in my country. So you have to recognize that there's external power dynamics, but there's also internal.
Yeah.
So if we're trying to introduce food sovereignty in the way Nigeria was trying to introduce, you have to deal with the existing power structure. Either co-opt them or invite them or participate with them or eliminate them, somehow deal with power. Otherwise, it will eat you alive and it will destroy anything you're trying to do. So that's also something we need to recognize. And many leaders, to go back to the initial question, many leaders, even when they make the effort to move in the right direction, they don't have the tools to see how this can be done successfully. And they think at the end of the day, well, this is too much transformation. This is long term. The long term starts today. The long term
mhm,
started yesterday, right? So you start step by step and you get yourself out of these structural traps. And of course, it's
mhm,
easier to do it as a block, as a South-South cooperation, because not every country can produce rice, not every country can produce corn, but collectively as a continent, we do have that complementarity of capabilities.
I'm glad you mentioned those power structures, because as we address the roots of the problem, that is the root of the problem, the power structures, right? And I'm speaking having read The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where
Yeah,
we know that the West intentionally recruits these leeches, we call them African leaders, I call them leeches, recruits these leeches, gives them access to, like you said, those 4 individuals in Nigeria who have contracts, right? So they can build their own personal wealth, and sell everyone out. And then they fight and kill and defend that personal wealth. We have currently, because Ruto is being threatened in Kenya to lose his personal wealth that he's gaining by selling Kenyans, he's abducting and killing and creating fear. So that power structure, I think, is the root of the problem. As you are listing the solutions, whether we cooperate with them, whether we invite them, whether we eliminate them, I think the eliminate option is the only option. How do we do it? I don't know. No, I'm seriously.
I
You
know, I
cannot.
know, I know.
I'm not inviting the devil to work with me when I know the devil is the devil. Like, seriously, if someone has proven that the way they move is through killing and destroying, you cannot cooperate with them. You have to understand who you're working with, and it would be stupid for me to invite such a person to work with them. So the only option is eliminate. I agree with you. We have to unite to do so. We have to figure out what we're going to do to eliminate the leeches in our community so that we can start building our economies. Quickly, for my question, quickly. So we talk about the debt, right? And people talking about we have to pay the debt before we do anything, if we, all that. But it's revealed again by John Perkins in Confessions of an Economic Hitman and The Secret History of the American Empire, both his books, that this money does not actually come to us most of the times. So we actually don't
Yeah,
even owe money.
yeah,
So when the IMF comes to us and says, oh, these are the things that you can do to build your economy, and the World Bank, these are the things that you can do to build your economy, we say, okay, we'll do it. The contract is assigned to a US multinational to carry out. So the money that they claim they're lending us is paid to a
Sure.
US entity and therefore going back into a US economy. Logically, it has been paid back upon borrowing, and yet they come
Absolutely.
back to collect. And this is the thing that it doesn't make sense to me. So please make sense to me why we Africans are not rising up against that.
Well, it's actually worse. At least, I mean, in this
Oh,
case, you're
please
talking about
explain
loans.
exactly how worse it is. Lay it on the table.
wow.
Because what you're describing is a loan, and you can say, well, the loan was to pay for the contract for this American company or British company to do the work, and that's why the money went there. But even aid, food aid, medical aid, you know, sometimes it ends up costing you. Because, for example, in the U.S. U.S. law says that any aid given to any particular country, whether it's for a pandemic or for a famine or whatever, shipments of wheat, for example, to a country on the continent, the cost of shipping is not included in the aid, and it's mandated that not only the product needs to come from the U.S. You can't bring wheat from France gifted by the U.S. to an African country. It has to be U.S. wheat, but you also have to use a U.S. shipping company, right? So all the cost, suppose the millions of dollars of this aid given to a particular country is actually going to U.S. farmers and U.S. shipping companies and so on. So it actually gets worse than that when it comes to IMF loans, in particular, because the IMF is a lender, operates as a bank, and it has a credit rating, just like any other institution has a credit rating. So they want to keep their AAA credit rating all the time, presumably for good reason, so that they can borrow at a lower cost, so they can lend to us at a lower cost. We can accept that fact. But it also means that when a country is about to default, when a country is in a debt crisis and is about to default on its debt to the IMF, like Argentina did, for example, many times, that means that the IMF is technically not a good lender because its customers are defaulting on it. So it could affect its credit ratings. So what the IMF does to make sure that nobody ever defaults on the IMF is to negotiate with the country that's just about to default to give them a new loan so that they can pay the old loan on time, so that on paper nobody defaulted, right? And of course, when you're pressured as a country in the middle of a debt crisis to do that, the terms of the lending get worse and worse every cycle, which means the conditionalities, the restrictions, the rate at which you have to pay, the penalties, the fees get you deeper and deeper into debt traps. And that is, that is that is the quagmire that most of our countries are in. And none of this is going to stop until we recognize that there's got to be an alternative way, right? We can't just persist in this system. And you've probably heard me say this before about the World Bank and the IMF. I mean,
Yeah.
they're supposedly operating as banks, right? And banks should respond to the mandate, the mission, right? And should report back to their shareholders, right? This is what banks and the private sector do. Who are the shareholders of these institutions? The biggest shareholder is the United States, for example, and Europe and the industrialized world. So if you, as major shareholders, have this institution that is supposedly designed to produce development, right, and improve the conditions of the countries that they're operating with, and decade after decade, these countries are getting deeper into debt crises and are not moving forward on development, on health, on education, all of these things that are supposedly, straightforward development issues that these institutions are supposed to deal with. If you have lenders, if you have managers, right, the presidents and vice presidents and the major, executive staff of your bank who are just failing miserably, don't you fire them? Don't you ask them to, fix, their approach? Don't you assess, the theoretical and the policy approach that they're doing? No, but these guys get rewarded. Though after they leave their position as head of the World Bank
Yeah.
or the IMF, they get a
Yeah.
Nobel Prize,
Yeah.
they get
Yeah.
appointed Secretary of Treasury or Minister of Finance in France, or, nothing. Which tells you that the shareholders, the major shareholders, are very happy with their performance, right?
Yeah.
Because these are colonial institutions. Let's remember the IMF and the World Bank, when they were created in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the meeting that created these institutions, the majority of the global South were still colonies. These institutions were designed during a colonial period for colonial purposes. They were not designed for development or for a just transition or for the SDGs or for democracy or anything. So, of course, the shareholders today are very happy with their performance because they're doing exactly what they were designed to
I'm,
continue
I'm
the colonial structure.
I'm glad you mentioned them, Oladile and Fadhel. I recently found out, again, we are all learning, that the head of the World Bank is appointed by the US president. It's called the World Bank,
And the head of the IMF is
Yeah.
always a European.
appointed
Yeah.
by the
The
US
agreement from the beginning.
president.
Yeah.
So Trump is coming in and he's going to appoint the head of the World Bank, and we're calling it the World Bank. Again, we have normalized cognitive dissonance and we need to stop it. Oladile, go ahead. It's
Yeah. Bro, before I go to the questions, we were talking before you came on, we're talking about climate change, debt decarbonization with that economic decolonization.
Mhm.
We see what they're pushing at the moment, carbon decarbonization, excuse me, they're trying to offset this and offset that. For me, it just makes no sense because basically the biggest polluters are the hegemonic powers. Africa is basically not polluting nothing, it's them. So how does the upset affect Africans? Why is Africa paying for things that they're not doing? Can you explain that to me, please?
Yeah, I think you've heard me say the phrase, you can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet.
Yes.
And just to start with the facts, as you correctly pointed out, the African continent, our cumulative emissions since the Industrial Revolution is less than 4% of global emissions. Less
Wow.
than 4%. That is the equivalent of Spain alone, just Spain, which is a small economy, by the way,
Wow.
compared to the other ones. So that's the emissions of the African continent. So clearly, we're not responsible for any of this, and yet we're on the front lines of climate change. And you see the severe climate events, the droughts, the floods, and so on across the continent. So there's a very simple concept in in the climate space that all countries have agreed on many, many years ago, which is called the carbon budget. That is, the planet has a certain amount of carbon that we are allowed to burn safely to live on this planet. And that budget is divided up based on the size of the country and its population and so on. So each country has a budget. We in the global south, we did not consume any of our budget to begin with. But countries that have industrialized have overconsumed and spent way beyond their budget. They actually started to spend the budget that's allocated to us. They appropriated it from us and consumed it already, right?
Wow.
So this leads us to a very simple concept, which is called climate debt. And the concept of debt is very straightforward. If I owe you $100, I'm supposed to pay you $100. You can be, a nice person, and we can sit down and negotiate a payment plan. But at the end of the day, I give you $100, and you don't have to give me anything in return because it's a debt, right? But unfortunately, if I explain to you the concept of climate finance, the way it's actually being used today, you'll be outraged. So let me
Please tell us. I want
Please
in,
explain.
in
We'll take
simple
your time.
So in climate finance negotiations, instead of me giving you the $100 that I owe you for climate debt, here's what I do. I give you $3 and I tell you exactly what to do with them to get you deeper into economic traps. And you have to follow my conditionalities and restrictions. But I'm giving it to you as a grant, as a gift, right? But I still tell you what to do with it because you're not responsible enough to know what to do with the money you're owed. And then I feel bad because you clearly need more than $3. So I'm going to lend you $7 with concessional rates, noblesse oblige. And then again, I have to tell you exactly what to do with those $7. And I'm not going to give you the $7 all at once. I give you, 50 cents every, year. And you have to report back to me and tell me what you did with it. And then I give you another 50 cents and you have to pay interest on it, right? So, but clearly the climate crisis is bigger than that. So you really need more money than the 3 that I gave you and the 7 that I lent you. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you $20. $20. But in return, you have to give me your forest for carbon credits to offset my pollution, right? So I can buy pollution permits from you. They call them carbon credits. We call them pollution permits. And once you designate your forest as carbon market territory, you have to protect it. Protect it from whom? From the indigenous people that protected the forest for thousands of years. You have to kick them out. Right? Exactly. Right? And we have to bring in all kinds of experts and pay commissions and fees and everything. And the $20 that I gave you for carbon credits, by the way, you have to use them immediately to pay your debt to me. So you don't actually get the $20.
Wow.
But we call that a climate finance solution. And then here's what we can do to bring in even more financing to your climate problem. We're going to have you deregulate your entire economic system so we can bring our companies to invest another $20 to produce green hydrogen for me, not for you, right? Use your water and your land and your solar energy to produce green hydrogen for me. What I'm describing is literally what is being negotiated at COP negotiation.
Wow.
Here's how climate finance works. And then I'm going to build a green industrial zone in your country to create jobs for you. And it's going to be green, solar and hydrogen and all of that. But you're going to have to use low-cost labor and low-cost energy from your country to assemble consumer goods for me, not for you, not to build the building blocks of development.
Wow.
And you're sitting there looking at me and saying, but wait a minute, where's my $100? Why am I giving you my forest? Why am I giving you my hydrogen? Why am I working for you? Why am I kicking out the indigenous people from their own land? Give me my $100.
But the sad thing, Fadhel, is we don't even get to that part where we ask, where's my $100? Because the fool sitting at the table under this negotiation is being told, oh, hold on. If he or she, mostly he, dares ask or before they even ask, it's anticipated, right? Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. You will be fine. You'll be taken care of. You can take your child to Yale. You have access to this and that and that. Don't worry. We know this does not look fair, but don't worry. You will be taken care of. And they walk away with that deal, knowing that they themselves will be okay, even if everyone else is suffering. Is Fadhel frozen?
Yeah, it looks like.
Listen, these imperialists found out what he was saying. They froze him.
Oh, then let's bring him back.
This is very informative.
It's very, very. Give me a second.
But here's my question, Oladile, as we continue to be informed, right? We keep coming in these rooms talking about how informed we were, walking away and doing nothing. We keep coming in these rooms talking about how informed we are, walking away and doing nothing. Fadhel and multiple guests who've come here have told us we need to unite. What are we doing to unite? What are you in your home right now? Everyone who's commenting here, what are you doing to unite? We've talked about Oladile, Nduko, our organizations are doing something to bring us together. Are you reaching out to us to ask what is happening? When are we meeting? Right? What are you doing to unite us all? Forget about waiting for the presidents to do so. Welcome back, Fadhel. So my question to everyone as we continue the conversation is, what is each and every one of us doing to unite us? Because we can no longer depend on these presidents, right? Traore is alone, and when asked how he can be helped, he said, we need to go back to our countries and build revolution. That's how we can help him, because he needs us all to come together to build what you're saying, the united front, right? So what is each and every one of us doing to build that unity so that we can rise up against these forces? Because we cannot, the only destination is death and extermination for us if we continue with this. That's the only destination. And Niger is evidence of that. There are rivers where there's no longer fish, it's oil and fumes coming out of them. So as you come back, I'm going to ask a simple one, yet complex question. What are your thoughts on capitalism?
Well, so I'll start with the first question. How do
Yes,
we
please.
get there, and then we'll get to capitalism, or any ism. I'm not a big fan of any ism. We need to figure out what needs to be done, and whatever that thing that needs to be done, then we can put an ism to it and name it something. But we can come back to that.
All we need is Ubuntu, my brother. Ubuntu. That's all we need. I'll let you carry on.
Exactly. So you have a very simple kind of. I'm a teacher. I'm an educator, so I believe in teaching, but also in building movements. What you need is each one teach one, right? What we need is building from the grassroots level all the way up to Traore's office, right? Because Traore by himself is not going to be able to do anything, right? I mean, he can be inspiring, he can be a leader, but you need the masses to recognize and understand what needs to be done. Because Traore is not going to be there doing everything for us, right? And he doesn't know everything. He's not an economist. He's not a political scientist. He's a patriot who's trying to do his best, right? But he's counting on millions of us to know what needs to be done and to move towards that particular goal. And Traore is alone in Burkina Faso, right? He doesn't govern the continent, right? So we need much more than.
I was about to say, although Kenyans claimed him the other day as their president, but go on.
I saw that on social media, yeah. But what, in order to get to what some of us call a revolution, you need to have not just the pitchforks, but the well-informed pitchforks, which means you need to educate, inspire, empower, mobilize, organize in the millions, right? And it starts in places like this, community spaces where people are educating and empowering themselves and organizing and mobilizing themselves. It starts on social media and platforms like yours and others, where people are kind of converging towards the same goals. Now, we all know that there are problems, but it's one thing to identify a problem on the surface level. It's another thing to identify its root causes and to identify strategic lines of action that need to be taken and build consensus on those things. Like we started this discussion today and said, well, there's three core things: food, energy, industrialization. There are some key problems. There are people standing in the way, those who have the abusive market power to
Yeah.
control the imports of rice and wheat. Those are vested interests in our own countries. So you start building and organizing strategies. How do we undo these power structures? How do we deal with the external pressures? And how do we transition towards more resilient, sovereign, independent, Pan-African approach to development and prosperity to unleash its potential? So I don't know what ism to put on this, and I don't really care what ism to put on it,
Yeah.
as long as we're mobilizing and organizing towards these strategic lines of action that must be taken.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to go to the questions now because of time. Okay, the first question.
You're muted.
All right, sorry. I'm just going to go to the questions now. Actually, I've got quite a few. Okay, the first one here says, considering Africa's vast diversity with 54 nations, many of which continue to align their economic policies with Western, Chinese, and Russian interests, what will be the most effective and unified pathway for the continent to achieve sustainable economic development? Should Africa focus on regional integration, self-reliance, or strategic partnerships? And how can it balance external influences with its own development priorities?
Very good question. So I'll start by saying that, if we as Africans don't have a strategic vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's vision, whether it's China or the US or Europe. And of course, every major economic bloc has every right to have a vision for itself. And they have every right to use economic incentives and diplomacy to nudge everybody to where they want to see them in their vision. But so do we. We have the right to develop our own strategic vision and use our own resources and leverage and economic diplomacy to nudge each other and nudge everybody else to where we want to see them in our vision. And that's how you create a multilateral system of negotiations and so on. So here's the problem, though. All the major economic blocs, more or less, have the same vision for us. They have the same colonial role imposed on us, which is we're going to give them our critical minerals on the cheap, we're going to consume their technology, and we're going to be the assembly line manufacturing for technologies they no longer need. That is the same colonial role. So we go back to square one. Our vision cannot be that. Otherwise, this is exactly the role they want us at the bottom of the hierarchy, and you can't blame them. Why would you blame them if we're not doing anything about it? Then we continue to do this, and every now and then they give us some crumbs,
Yeah.
which is what we get. So our approach in this very unique geopolitical moment, if we manage to create a unified bloc, it doesn't have to be the entire continent at first, but we need a critical mass of countries with a market size of 500, give or take, million consumers. So, and they don't have to be neighboring countries. Of course, ideally, it will be the regional economic communities, right? Because it's more convenient. But picture for a moment, just imagine for a moment that we have, high level political commitment between 5, 10, 15 countries with a critical mass of a population of, say, 500 million consumers. Imagine for a second that that economic bloc is united in developing and co-designing a joint industrial policy, real industrial policy, to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development, not to assemble for other people to consume. So to manufacture the renewables infrastructure, the material infrastructure that we need for our food sovereignty, the transportation infrastructure that we need, the clean cooking infrastructure, real industrial policies, using the complementarity of our resources and capabilities. We have all the critical minerals we need on the continent. So imagine for a second we have that high level political commitment to this joint, Pan-African industrial policy. What we lack is access to the manufacturing technology. We want to manufacture solar, wind turbines, high-speed rail, right? All of this, we have the resources, the labor, but we don't have the technology. And some people will say we don't have the money. I disagree, and I'll explain why we don't need actually the dollars. And this is actually how you de-dollarize at the same time. Imagine for a second that bloc going to a country like China today, which has this technology, and saying, look, we give you the bargain of the century. If you agree to share your technology, become our in-kind joint venture contributor. So normally we need the dollars to import the technology. But if we have a joint venture, you bring in-kind resources, and we contribute with labor and material resources. Each one of our countries, we pay for our labor with the national currency, not with dollars. We pay for our natural resources with the national currencies, not with dollars. So this is the de-dollarized industrial policy. And our joint venture partner will bring in-kind machinery. Minimal, financing cost will be involved. Here's what the bargain is. Why would China agree to this? They say, look, if you do this on our terms, not on your terms, as a real partner, here's what you get in return. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you double your geopolitical weight globally. In 10 to 15 years, you also secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, we in the global south, we have to remember that we are the global majority. We're more than 80% of the world population, combined.
Yep.
We're bigger than the US plus Europe and Japan and Australia markets combined. The problem is we don't have purchasing power yet. So the bargain here, in addition to what I described, China can have access to the largest market on the planet with purchasing power if we actually industrialize and develop. Much bigger than the markets that they're losing today in the US and Europe, right? They're being, restricted in terms of exporting their EVs to Europe and the US. And we say, we're the biggest market on the planet. You should work with us. I guarantee you China will accept the bargain. And here's the thing. The purpose of this bargain is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy. The purpose of this bargain is to reposition Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new international economic order. And here's how. As soon as we trigger that bargain with China, we immediately create a second bargaining chip. We can take it now and go to European countries and say, look, we give you the same bargain. You can have the same thing if you share your technology with us as a real partner, not as a neo-colonial abuser. We want to partner with you to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology, high-speed rail technology, pharmaceutical technology, whatever we decide are the building blocks that we need for our development. At that point, they can't say no. Because if Europeans say, no, wind turbine technology, we don't share it. High-speed rail, no, we don't share it. Say, okay, well, China has high-speed rail too. We'll let them quadruple their economic weight if you don't partner with us. So, of course, they have to partner at that point. But, of course, to start this, and this is why I say the purpose is to position us at the center rather than position China or Europe or the US at the top of the hierarchy. And this is how you'd really create a multipolar world. That's why I always say a new multipolar world, which everybody's talking about, cannot be born without Africa being at the center of this new system, right? It can't be created while Africa is still at the bottom of the hierarchy, including BRICS, by the way. BRICS today is not creating the multipolar world we want, but it could potentially, right? BRICS today is still creating the same hierarchy with us being at the bottom of the hierarchy. So this is a dangerous game because geopolitics at that level is not for the faint of heart. So you can't go into these bargains without being fully prepared as a bloc yourself, fully prepared in terms of unity and long-term political commitment to this bloc. And also it may involve having a security pact, because it's not like the rest of the world will sit there and watch you rearrange the global hierarchy on terms that are favorable to you. And that is the reality. It's like walking into the lion's den. You don't go in unprepared, you get eaten alive. Whether it's the US or Europe or China or any other major economic bloc, they'll try to get the most out of it. So if you're not prepared and have a plan B, it's not going to work. So on paper, technically, this is within reach. The question now, do we have enough political leadership and mobilize civil society to actually build that unity and say, this is our way out? And that window of opportunity is closing very quickly.
Yeah, I think this is the awakening. Sorry, and go on before I ask the next question. Sorry.
Yes, I'm not sure if you spoke on capitalism, but because especially in the chat it is coming up, if you could
Yeah.
please speak on capitalism.
So capitalism, since we're talking today about decolonizing, capitalism is a system that was born and thrives on capitalism, thrives on colonial extraction, right? Capitalism, it's in the word. It's about capital. It's about capital accumulation, and capital accumulation works by extracting from workers, at the micro level within a particular industry or company. But on a global scale, what has capitalism done to us in the global south is extract, 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 right? Of course, there are certain features of capitalism that are so visible. Inequality, for example, the extraction, the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few. We see this on a global scale in unsustainable ways, and we see this in our own countries domestically. We also have our own capitalists, right? So as a system, what has it done for us? It created more inequality. It created the hierarchy that we're describing today. It reinforced the colonial roles that were imposed on the African continent. So as a system, it hasn't delivered the liberation that we're seeking for our economies. So just on those grounds, it means that we have to move beyond the basic tenets of capitalism. And when you think about the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, right, these are the global institutions that govern the current system. What have they done? With every loan, with every free trade agreement, they deeply reinforce the basic pillars of capitalism. So capitalism, you can think of it as four basic pillars. Number one is private property. And you have to create laws to protect private property and intellectual property, right? But of course, intellectual property only counts if it's been registered after capitalism was born. But indigenous knowledge can be stolen, right? A lot of it is pharmaceutical knowledge actually today that's been privatized. So that tells you about when capitalism was born, for what purpose, and when those laws apply and when they don't. So private property, self-interest, right? The individualistic self-interest has to be built into the individual entrepreneur, not in community organizing or development, and any other way of organizing your economy or society is obsolete and is contradictory to capitalism. So if you don't have that private property when it comes to land ownership, for example, which is a major problem that we have since colonial times in Africa and the global South in general. If you don't have land tenure, if any other system of land tenure and land inheritance doesn't work with capitalism, so it gets excluded from having access to technical assistance or financing or crops or anything. You can't do business with anybody that doesn't have land ownership under capitalist legal system, right? You can't get a bank loan. You can't get a technical assistance from your own Ministry of Agriculture if you don't own the land. So you become dispossessed, even though for thousands of years, communities around the world use that land very productively. So land can only become productive if it's owned privately and then becomes recognized in the capitalist system. So that's that private property, self-interest, competition, as defined in the narrowest sense of the term. Competition, not collaboration. And they tell you all these myths about competition. Competition is good for you, it's healthy. It's like in sports. Yeah, of course, in sports, who doesn't like competition? But here's the thing. For those of you who are, watch boxing or know a thing or two about boxing, competition amongst equal, right? In the Olympics, you'll never see a heavyweight champion in the ring with a lightweight champion. It's illegal. It's ugly. It's a disaster. Nobody wants to watch it, right? Yet in the real world, they tell you competition is good for you. You take a heavyweight industrial country like the United States or Germany, competing, right, in free trade competition with a lightweight like Kenya or Malawi and say, this is free trade. This is healthy. It's good for you. But it's good for you. You see what I mean? That's called competition. right? And it's designed for destruction, to destroy the smaller economy. And that's what we've seen in agriculture, and industry, and the energy market. But that's the myth of competition in capitalism, which is a basic pillar. If you don't have competition, if you have rules to protect your economy, then you're not capitalist. Then you don't qualify to join our club.
Mm-mm.
You don't qualify to get technical assistance or partnerships, or only when you open your economy for destruction under the label of competition, then we
It's
can call you
crazy.
our partner, right? Then we'll set up the red carpet for your president so you can come and sign agreements with us, right? Yeah.
Given what you just said, therefore, is there any such thing as good capitalism?
Well, there's, as they say, there's 57 varieties of capitalism. The phrase goes, there's like the ketchup varieties. some, some are uglier than others. But every system that labels itself capitalism, including the better version, sort of the Scandinavian sort of hybrid with socialist governance system, they call it capitalism and try to protect private property and competition and all of that. But then
Private.
at the same time, have very strong social protection mechanisms to introduce in order to validate the existence of the violence. So capitalism will throw
Mm.
people under the bus, and it's ugly. So to call it good capitalism, you have to create the support mechanism, right? And you do this at the national level in a country like Sweden or Denmark or whatever. So recognizing at the national level that this system will throw people under the bus
But
because
it still doesn't negate the fact that it's exploiting, right? You're just putting a band-aid on top of a really bad wound.
you're putting a very good band-aid on it in Denmark by supporting the
Wow.
individuals that would be thrown under the bus, by providing housing and healthcare and all kinds of things in a democratic system. But we're talking
Mm.
about a global system that is capitalism.
Hmm.
Who's going to provide that safety net for the rest of us at the bottom of the hierarchy? Nobody. And whatever
Nobody.
you call safety net comes in the form of charity and economic entrapment, and it's nowhere near the level of support. And we're not asking for charity and support. We're asking for reparations for damage that's been
Mm.
done by colonial abuse and ecological damage done by the global north. So this is not asking for help. This is asking for justice.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's why,
Obulungisa.
I mean, this whole discussion about capitalism to me is sort of useless at the end of the day,
Yeah.
because you have to go to the foundation. What needs to be done is decolonizing, and capitalism is part and parcel of a colonial system.
Exactly. And
Brilliant.
by the way, for those of you who don't speak English, or for those of you who don't speak anti-capitalism, that means eradicating. Eradicating all colonial systems, burning them, like taking a light and burning. You Africans are
Yeah.
very good at dancing and singing. Burn it, burn it. This time, burn everything attached to colonialism. Oladele, I'm muting.
Okay. I've got 5 questions there, so we're gonna go one at a time because of the time. The first one says, I don't know if you can see it there. I'm gonna put it to the screen. Um, can you read that? Considering the Inga Dam in the DRC has the potential to generate 40 gigawatts of electricity, enough to meet the energy needs of at least 28 African countries. Why has the project not been prioritized at a continental level? Is the lack of progress due to structural challenges, governance issues, or external influences? Could this be? Can you read it there? Okay, if you want to talk to that one.
Yeah, there are so many other similar, mega projects, including industrial projects, that have not seen the light of day. So I'm not an expert on the DRC or on the Inga Dam, but I understand its potential, and I understand the challenges that the DRC is facing, not just with that particular project, but you have to remember the DRC is the richest country in terms of resources,
Yeah, in the world.
excessively rich, actually, critical minerals, energy potential, and so on. why none of that is happening, and instead what we see is conflict, right? Who's benefiting from the conflict,
Yeah.
right?
Them.
It's not the local communities. How easy it is to fund local militias to perpetuate the conflict when those individuals from local communities have been thrown under the bus while hundreds of billions of dollars worth of wealth is extracted from their own land.
Mm.
Right? If you lived in those communities for decades with no housing, no food, no education, only pollution and extraction of wealth from your own ancestral land, and you don't see any of the benefits, if anybody shows up with a little bit of money and gives you a few weapons, I guarantee you'll join that militia and you'll fight, right?
So
And we see this, in every part of the continent where there is
I,
this kind of
I
excessive
love her. I love her.
extraction. So when you have that kind of insecurity and instability, it creates all kinds of problems domestically in terms of physically moving from one part of the country to the other, delivering cement and concrete and resources to build the dam is not going to happen, because what militias do is that they attack any construction project that's moving resources.
Mm.
So you see this violent, and Sudan is the same thing. Sudan is one
Yeah.
of the richest countries on the planet when it comes to agricultural potential. Sudan can feed the entire continent, and yet we see the instability and external interference and violence and militias being funded because
Yeah.
of the gold, because of the oil,
Because of the
because
gold, yeah.
of the
Yeah.
potential. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to the next one there. There's another one there. Show it. Okay. What other means used to prevent access to technology besides lack of financing?
Very good question. So, a few years ago, I used to be sort of naive about this question, because I thought if we just figure out what are the lines of strategic investment that we need to put in place, and we educate and mobilize and engage with our partners, with the World Bank, with the IMF, with our partners in the OECD countries, say, if we're going to partner, these are the priorities. I thought that this will be it. And then about a year and a half ago, almost now, I get this message from a senior editor at a major newspaper that all of you read, I guarantee you, who is very familiar with my work and with this question of transfer of technology and industrialization in the global south. And he reported that he just finished a 3-hour off the record interview with the senior official in the OECD in charge of industrialization. And the gist of that conversation was the following: nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without the approval of a hegemon.
Wow.
Period. That is it. And
Wow.
you think about it.
Wow.
I said, no, this is
We're at war, Fadhel. We're at war.
not surprising, but it's nice to get the confirmation in November 2023, not 1823, that this is still official thinking in the OECD
Wow.
behind closed doors. That everything else we get in these multilateral negotiations and press releases and press conferences and red carpet meetings is BS, right? Here's why: because real development is actually possible. And I'll explain to you the formula for it in a minute. And it's been done in other places. There are a few examples. But real development in Africa means Africa is no longer at the bottom of the hierarchy. You start disrupting a global hierarchy that was not meant to be disrupted. That's the real reason. I explained earlier why Africa's renewable energy potential is not allowed to take off,
Mm.
because that means you become an energy powerhouse, an industrial powerhouse. You're no longer at our mercy, and that cannot be allowed, right? So we have to realize that when you go to these COP negotiations or debt negotiations, they're not about climate, they're not about energy, they're not about debt, they're about power. So if you don't have power, leverage, you get nothing. You just get a bunch of BS at the end of the day. And we meet again next year and talk more about the same BS. So the example that I wanted to give you, Germany after World War II. when it lost the war, the US plan for Germany for the first, which was actually applied for the first 3 or 4 years, official US policy was for Germany to become a backwards nation, never to rise again, an agrarian society, never to industrialize. That was official US policy, and it was actually implemented until Marshall, the Marshall Plan, showed up and said, this is stupid. We need Germany to be a powerhouse to withstand the Soviet threat. So we need Germany to industrialize and develop and build, eventually became the second largest economy in the world at some point. So how was it done? The Marshall Plan was a gift from the US. It was not a loan. It was not economic entrapment. The US gifted 5% of its GDP, 5% of its GDP to rebuild Europe and rebuild Germany. It was an industrial plan for Germany. And it was coupled with the London Accords. You can Google the London Accords of 1955, I believe. And the London Accords, what did they do? Canceled 1953, I should say. The London Accords canceled 50% of Germany's debt. 50%. Can you imagine any African country today getting 50% of its debt canceled? Diplomats will be dancing on the tables if we announce that today. No country gets that treatment. So Germany, you cancel 50% of their debt, and you design an industrial policy for them, and you gift them 5% of your GDP, essentially, with transfer of technology, right, on terms that are favorable to development, and you create an industrial powerhouse. Why was Germany chosen? Well, Germany, because it was a geopolitical priority for the US. Similarly, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Israel, those are geopolitical priorities for the hegemon. We know how to create development. We know how to create industrial powerhouses like Singapore, like Japan, like South Korea, like Germany, like Israel. Only if we choose, right? And then the rest, what do they get? No debt cancellation, only economic entrapment. It's that simple.
Wow. Thank you. Okay, the next one. This one I'm very familiar with in Nigeria. Could you go into the structural adjustment programs? Are they even legal? Also, how are African countries accepting them? Because I remember this in Nigeria very, very well. Very, very well.
Yeah. So structural adjustment programs were really designed in the 80s during the debt crisis of the 80s. The debt crisis when most of our countries reached levels of indebtedness where they just couldn't service the debt anymore. And at that point, many countries were about to go into default. They had no foreign currency reserves anymore, and you had to either default on the debt to be able to buy food for your people and fuel for people. Remember, I talked about food and fuel being basic necessities, or accept these loans, but you have to restructure your economy, make it more open to free trade, right? Reduce subsidies to your own people, and do more restructuring of your legal system to give benefits and advantages to foreign investors so that they can come in and use your low-cost labor, low-cost materials to do assembly line manufacturing, right? To reinforce that third colonial role that I described earlier, to be locked at the bottom of the hierarchy. And when you're a country and you have no choice, your people are about to rise up against you, right? Because they're starving, because there are no jobs. So many countries accepted this, and in many cases, these were dictatorships that were. That
it was mainly during the military rule in Nigeria. Actually, I remember that very clearly.
Yeah. So yeah, that is, and if you read the Economic Confessions of
the
Economic Hitman.
Yep. Our favorite book. It's been on our program already, actually.
You get the details, and many ministers of finance of that period later in their lives, recounted some horror stories about what they were forced to do. I'll give you just one example, because there are few Latin American countries, led by Argentina at the time, who wanted to stand up to this system and said, you know what, we're going to create the debtors club. It's called the Cartagena Club because they met in Cartagena. And it was, to be very clear, it was, haphazard, put together strategy very quickly by a few presidents, led by Argentina's president. At the time, the US immediately said, you can't do that. You have to pay. You have to accept the conditions. You have to pay. And the US started, nudging individual countries, Latin American countries at the time, to leave the club, starting with Mexico and Colombia and Brazil. So at the end of the day, Argentina was the only country left in this club.
Wow.
And then the US came and said, and this is on the official record, threatened the president of Argentina by saying, this month, if you don't pay 85,000 in Argentina, 85,000 people who have diabetes will die this month because they will not have insulin. At the time, there was an insulin factory, a US manufacturer in Argentina, and the US did shut it down and move it to another country. And Argentina had to scramble to find insulin shots for their people. So that is the level of pressure.
I mean, as you talk about that, which is horrible. I mean, to Panama, right? What they do to Panama, because Panama wants to take the contract with Japan for the Panama Canal. And what does talk about that? What does the US do to them?
Yeah, the sabotage.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
Exactly.
they literally bomb them.
Yeah.
There's a long list of military interventions and assassinations
Yeah.
related to standing up to the system. Yeah, that's the legacy of structural adjustment programs.
And therefore, given that fact, we come to security, right? Because our plan, my plan, I don't know about any other African. If you're not with me, I guess I'll be unfortunate, just like Argentina, I'll be standing alone. But I hope you're all with me. My plan is to eradicate, remove imperialist nations from our throat, take their claws off, burn them, and send them back where they came from, and put a wall of fire that keeps them from coming back in, right? So we have to talk security. We need to talk security because we cannot build if we're not securing the thing that we're building. We understand that there will be retaliation. And you have said it. One of the best ways to fight retaliation is to move as a unit, all 54 of us. So please speak on that. And a lot of these conversations on security and defense are going to happen behind closed doors. But please say what you can about that.
Well, as I said earlier, when I was describing the bargain of the century, that initial block, before we get to 54 countries or beyond, let's say we're starting with 10, 15 countries.
Yeah.
Those countries need to have a security pact.
Yeah.
Because the lessons that we learned from Argentina, from other countries that, tried to stand up and refuse to pay the debt and try to build economic sovereignty was, gentle economic pressure first, and then actual military action, overthrowing governments and assassinations. So you should anticipate all of that, and including sanctions and isolations, right? Look at the way in which, and this is not a comment on the Ukraine conflict in particular, but look at the intensity of sanctions against Russia over the last few years and why Russia was able to actually withstand those sanctions. It's the most extreme economic sanctions we've seen in the history of the world. Why was Russia able to withstand and survive these sanctions? Some would say successfully, with success. Russia has food sovereignty. Russia has energy sovereignty. Russia has technological sovereignty, at least a certain degree of technological sovereignty. So it was able very quickly to, number one, survive internally, and number two, rewire and reroute its international trade and international payment system even with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is not imposing sanctions. Remember, there's a global majority and there's a global minority.
Yeah.
Right? And the global majority always survives as long as you have food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, a certain degree of technological sovereignty. Right? This is the lesson that we have to learn. But Burkina Faso is not going to be able to survive without food sovereignty if even a small amount of sanctions is imposed on its economy. Landlocked country with very little resources. But as a block of countries, we have way more potential for food sovereignty, for energy sovereignty, for development. And again, as a major block of the global south, we're the global majority. We can survive without the minority as long as we build our own internal food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, development infrastructure. And all of that, you have to recognize that the global minority has military superiority. So, so anything that threatens the existing hierarchy, at the end of the day, they will pull out that card, which is
Yeah.
military intervention. We've seen it repeatedly. So you should not be surprised to consider it as one of the options that will be used.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yeah. This is a battle. This is a war. As I hear this, man, I'm thinking, wow, wow, we got work. We got work to do, Fadhel. We actually got a lot of work to do, man. Okay, I got another question there. What's the most recent headline or government initiative announcement, which, as soon as you saw it, you could see through the light and negative implication for Africa, for the country?
Oh man. Okay.
Any latest initiative that you saw?
Yeah. So this is what I described recently as probably one of the most dangerous combination of policies in the climate space when it comes to the global south, which is the combination of quote unquote green industrial zones in Africa combined with CBAM. CBAM is an acronym that stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It was introduced by the EU recently.
What a lot of cobblers.
So here's how it works. So, on the surface of it, CBAM is supposed to be a climate, solution, right? It's supposed to essentially be a tariff that is imposed on any product that is coming into the EU that has carbon content. So if it was produced in a green industrial zone with green electricity, it enters the EU without paying a tax. So it's supposed to encourage exports of green stuff and discourage exports of, things that are carbon intensive. But here's the thing. First of all, the UK is about to introduce its own CBAM soon. The US, Canada, Japan, Australia, all of the major, industrialized countries are developing CBAM-like regulations that they will introduce soon. So here's the thing. When Germany invests in a green industrial zone in Namibia, for example, which is the biggest, prototype industrial zone, you're producing a lot of green electricity, which means, of course, it's using a lot of land space to build solar and wind, displacing people from their own land, right? The descendants, by the way, of the victims of the genocide in Namibia are being displaced in the name of development and green industrialization by
It's
Germany
crazy.
again, right?
Crazy.
Um, but set that aside. Uh, Namibia doesn't have any water, right? It's a drought-stricken country, but it has the ocean. So there's seawater desalination, which requires massive amount of solar, by the way, to produce the fresh water that you need in order to produce green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is a water-thirsty technology, right? All of that is being done. Extraction of resources, displacement of people, using solar energy to produce green hydrogen for Germany. But then there's the green industrial zone, which is fed with a lot of green electricity. But what is being produced in that green industrial zone is all the obsolete assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in Europe is being assembled by low-cost labor and low-cost energy in Namibia. So Namibia is not producing the building blocks of its own development. It's assembling stuff with its own resources for Europe. But here's the beauty of this combination. When those products are shipped back to the EU, they don't pay the CBAM tax because they're green. So it turns out that this combination is doing two things. One is locking Namibia at the bottom of the colonial hierarchy as usual, and Europe is still at the top. Number two, it's acting as a booster to the European economy in the sense that CBAM is an inflation management tool for the European consumers to keep the cost of those goods low, right? Because those products go in without paying the tax and they're low cost labor, low cost energy. So that's an inflation management tool. And number two, it's also a trade weapon against the EU's competitors who don't have green industrial zones yet. So if you're China, if you're Japan, if you're the US, and you're trying to export stuff to the EU, you have to pay the CBAM tax, which is why now everybody's rushing to introduce their own CBAM and to introduce their own green industrial zones in Africa. So when we went to COP, everybody was celebrating the announcements of all these green industrial zones to produce green electricity for global north economies to come assemble their stuff so they can have an inflation management tool for their people and a trade weapon against their competitors. And it's not just Namibia, of course, it's all over now. Mauritania has massive green steel, which is very energy intensive. Green steel, not for Mauritania, not for Africa. Green steel to go into Europe without paying the CBAM tax, because Japanese and Korean and Brazilian steel now has to pay a CBAM tax because it's carbon intensive. So to me, this is the most dangerous combination that is being sold to us as a climate finance solution. All the climate finance is now going to go to green industrial zones.
So not only are they not sharing the technology for manufacturing, they're even now going further, which they've done from before, and having us produce it while not keeping it.
Exactly.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Fadhel, as I listen to you, I'm actually gobsmacked. Sometimes I'm lost for words, man, because this is deeper than we know what's going on. But when we bring people like you on the show, you basically give us a deeper knowledge and understanding of what's really going on. And we really thank you for your time with us today. Really appreciate you. Okay. I'm just gonna ask. Why is Africa still using the dollars, man? Why? Because I'm Nigerian and I hear the dollar, everything they say, the dollar is expensive, the dollar. They keep talking about the dollar about everything. That's why that. It basically every excuse, every economic excuse is basically the dollar. Why is Africa still hell bent on using the dollar? What's wrong with us? Why can't we? I know it's difficult based on everything you said. I know it's not an easy thing to do. But how can we get ourselves away from? We need to start somewhere.
Yeah. So that's why, I mean, just like I said before, you can't decarbonize a system without
Decolonizing it. Yeah.
Similarly, you can't de-dollarize the system that if it hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. So what I described earlier in the beginning of our discussion, the fact that we have that structural trade deficit that weakens our currency relative to the dollar, forces you into borrowing more dollars. And now that we have debt denominated in dollars, you have to reprioritize everything you do to earn those dollars to pay the debt on time. What happens if you don't pay the debt on time? You have no money to buy food or fuel or medicine. You get isolated economically. Lenders will not provide anything. The IMF will not provide anything. Nobody will do business with you, right? So you're locked into that position. You're not going to be able to de-dollarize until you address the root causes of your debt, which are colonial roots, by investing in food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and industrial policies that get you out of that trap. And what I described as the joint industrial policy is the de-dollarization policy, because it allows you to truly industrialize, create millions of jobs within the bloc, and build the building blocks of your development without borrowing a single dollar, because every country pays for its labor, for its materials in its national currency. And then the joint venture partner that you bring with the bargain of the century, they bring in-kind contribution. They don't have to bring any dollars. And now you have everything you need to industrialize.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer, man. Before, because I'm going to round up now because of time. Go on.
Yeah, and then also you see that last question there, which we need to ask. But
yeah, I was going to ask him.
What you're saying is we collectively have to push that stop button, not caring what they think, right? Not caring what they think or how they're going to react. Just push it and then erase everything, and then come together without them and without their ways and without their policies and not caring about them, and put together our own structure and systems that are based on our needs and our well-being.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay,
want
I was gonna ask you a question, but there's one more. I'm gonna stick this last one in here from LinkedIn. Any proposals to calibrate the mind of our so-called economist? Oh, that's brilliant.
There was also the one about the books.
Yeah, I was gonna ask that one last anyway.
Go on. Okay.
Yeah, this question basically, I ask these questions all the time because I'm in community with economists, and we cannot talk economists because all they tell me is basically the crap that they've learned. So please.
Well,
And Ha Jung Chang mentions that. I'm sure you've read him. He mentions that. He says that any economist that's trained under the Western system is useless. They're basically everything solution they come is supporting capitalism, which is useless. But go ahead, Fadhel.
And what
yeah,
makes you different, Fadhel? Because you're an economist. What makes you different?
I was partly educated in Tunisia. I did my undergraduate degree in Tunisia, but then I did my graduate work in the United States. But I was fortunate to be in a graduate program that is not a mainstream or orthodox economics program. So you still learn the mainstream approach so that you know what you're dealing with. But on top of that, you learn the critical perspective, which is sometimes called heterodox economics. Notice that we use almost religious terms because these are like religions, right? The
Mm,
orthodox approach to economics and the heterodox approach. And these are all the alternative kind of schools of thought, starting with Marxism, feminism, post-Keynesianism, institutionalism, all the alternative approaches that build sort of critiques of the mainstream approach, critiques of neoliberalism and capitalism and all of that. So I learned from that. So anybody who's studying economics and doesn't know anything from the heterodox side of the profession is not going to be a useful policy advisor, in my opinion. So make sure you read people like Hajun Cheng, the kicking away the ladder, and then follow the literature that's actually critical of free trade, critical of neoliberal economic policies, and then you'll find all kinds of interesting perspectives, and then you develop your own sort of approach and your own solutions. Make sure you read, African economists like Ndongo Sambasila, who's one of the best Senegalese economists we have, a colleague of mine who has written quite a bit critiquing the CFA franc zone. That's a whole other decolonizing project to get rid of the colonial currency that still governs, quite a few countries on the continent, especially in West Africa. The francophone. I mean, you have to remember CFA. The C and CFA in French used to stand for Colonie Française d'Afrique. And of course,
wow.
after independence, you can't call them colonies anymore, so you call them communities.
Wow.
And it's still
Wow.
governed by the French treasury, essentially, with, of course, the headquarters in Cote d'Ivoire to make it look like an African central bank, but it's not.
It reminds me of a joke. I say it's a joke because I was laughing at the individual before we go, Oladile. A black woman just like me, even darker than me, from Grenada, and she's telling me she's French, and I'm saying, oh, wait, but you're from Grenada? Yes, but I'm French. But you're
Yes.
from Grenada. She says, I'm French. It is a French governance, or so, what do they call it? Department, a French
Yeah.
department. I say,
Mm.
no, 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 no. That's a French colonial, and no, 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 it's a French department. We are just as French as.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of quickly, in terms of reading on climate, and so if you go to justtransitionafrica.org, you'll find the Just Transition report that I had the opportunity to contribute to, which is published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which was convened by Dr. Yuba Sukona of Mali, who at the time was the vice chair of the IPCC. So you'll find a lot of these ideas in that report. Again, justtransitionafrica.org. It's available in English and French, by the way.
Okay.
I would say also make sure you follow the work of Jason Hickel, on energy, on climate, on isms, capitalism, socialism, and on degrowth. The resource extraction extractivism, excellent work by Jason Hickel. There's a report that is 50 years old, believe it or not. It's called What Now? Another Development. The subtitle is Another Development. It's called What Now? It was produced 50 years ago and really had...
I think I posted it on LinkedIn, actually. I saw that. You sent that to me. Yeah, I posted it on LinkedIn. Yeah.
It's an excellent report. And a lot of these ideas that we're discussing here were really part of the major discourse in that era of post-colonial independence, when everybody was talking about, okay, now we have independence, now we need to finish the unfinished business of decolonizing economic structures. And that report comes out of that tradition. And it's brilliant because it has all the building blocks of what should have been done in the last 50 years. But unfortunately, we have to not reinvent the wheel, but build on that tradition and kind of update it in the current context. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that document, because it's a gold mine of ideas. And of course, decolonizing the mind so that we know what the foundations. You need to read Decolonizing the Mind to understand, whether you're in economics or in philosophy or in any other field, or history for that matter. So once you start reading things like that, one thing will lead to another, and you'll find yourself in a truly kind of set of literature that's allowing you to think outside the box and to become really creative in your own way, regardless of what your field is.
Thanks, Fadhel. Okay, just to round it up, it's our tradition on the podcast to actually ask our guests. Our previous guest actually left a question for you, so we're gonna ask them your question. The question they give to you, you're gonna ask. Are you gonna answer that? And then you're gonna leave a question for our next guest. And it's actually quite appropriate, the question that we got. And the question says, "Why would you believe we can fix Africa? Why would you believe we can fix Africa?"
Why do I believe that we can fix Africa?
Yes, that's the question that last guest left.
That's a very easy question, I should say.
Oh.
This is what motivated quite a bit of my work.
Wow.
It's because we have the richest continent on the planet. It's always been rich. I mean, I think I said it before. If the continent was poor, we would never have been colonized. Of being nothing of interest to anybody. And the reason we're still colonized, and the reason we're still the target of everybody in terms of extraction, is because the continent is so rich in resources and potential. And I think it can be done because we have everything that it takes. We have the youngest labor force on the planet. We have, social movements in the climate space, in the debt space, and the democracy and human rights and gender and equity space that is so vibrant across the continent and so motivated and mobilized. What we need is coordination so that we're all pushing in the same direction towards the same goal. And what we need is to up the pressure on our political leaders so that they can actually truly work on that Pan-African unity. Not just, nice fluffy words they say to each other and when they go to Addis for the meetings, but actually do the hard work of building that unity and creating the economic and geopolitical leverage that will make us unstoppable as a continent. So that's what motivates my work, because I truly believe it's within reach. It's possible. It's like I said earlier, it's like the real Wakanda is right there. I can see it.
I actually agree with you, man. And guys, we actually have got work to do, and the work starts now, like Fadhel said. Okay, can you leave a question for our next guest, please, if you don't mind?
Oh, without knowing who the guest is.
Without knowing,
Exactly.
this is how we do it.
Oh, nice. Okay, this is creative. So the question is, what are you trying to do to support the effort of building a truly Pan-African, united, prosperous continent? And how can you help share your approach with others so we can multiply your efforts?
That's a very, very deep one. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I've got that. Ndukwu, have you got it?
I'll play it back.
Yeah, okay.
I didn't get it all, but I'll play it back.
We got that anyway. And
Yes.
Fadhel, I've got to say thank you very much for your time, brother. You've basically been very informative, very, that you shared so much wisdom, I've learned. And guys, we do this not for the sake of doing it, but to share wisdom, to share knowledge, to show us the way forward. Because like Fadhel said, we are our own solutions. We need to look inwards within ourselves. We're more than capable of doing all these things. The main thing, the only thing that's missing is the unity. Unity of purpose, intentional unity of purpose. And this is basically what we need. When we collaborate intentionally without compromising ourselves, we can do the unthinkable.
Yes.
So yeah, I believe that. And I'm like you, Fadhel, I'm hopeful. I'm not giving up in my lifetime. I don't think that there's going to be, and there's always there's a change, there's a mindset shift already happening anyway. We just got to catch the wind now before it sails us back.
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for hosting.
Brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. Okay. Thanks, guys, for watching. Thanks for listening. Please share. Join our YouTube channel, Emerging Alkebulan.
Did Fadhel? Sorry, did you mention a Senegalese economist? Someone is asking for the name.
Yes, Ndongo Sambasila.
Ndongo Sambasila. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Give us a second. We're going to put it.
You can
type it. Yeah.
It's called in the English version of his co-authored book is called Africa's Last Colonial Currency. It's about the CFA franc.
Okay.
I just found it. Let me share it in the chat quickly.
Okay.
Give me a second, Ladile.
I've copied it. I'm gonna copy it. You got it? Just copy it here. Just put it there.
They have it on JSTAR too. So
paste.
And it's available in French and English.
There you go. I'll put it there. Okay.
You just put it in the chat?
Yeah. And don't go Sambisi. Yeah, I've just posted it.
It should be.
No. I mean the book. Hold on, Oladile. All right, there we go. That link is the book that Fadhel just mentioned.
All right, thank you very much, Fadhel. Nduku, thanks for being my partner as always. It's always a pleasure to be in community and to be on the front line. We appreciate everybody that watched this, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon.
Koheri.